Okay, good morning. Thank you so much for joining our session. You are in Beyond Bookstores. This is going to be a discussion about genre. But before we get started with the session, I'd like to do just a quick little boilerplate reminder. I'm sure since this is day 2, welcome, you have heard this before, but there's just a few reminders. First, if you have questions for our panelists, at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you're going to see a Q&A icon probably on the bottom right-hand side. So that's where you will ask your questions. And on the back end of the session, we're going to be going to those questions and I'll be sharing them with our panelists. Also, there's going to be a chat that runs parallel to our discussion. We have someone managing chat, and that's where some links are going to be dropped in about the authors, their websites, their books, additional information about topics that we're talking about. So it's very free-flowing and it's awesome. So make sure to check that out as well. If you feel like you're in the wrong session or you get curious about another session for later, those links, remember, are in your program, and you should have that program and should already be using it to get to different sessions. If you have any kind of one-on-one pitch or agent or mentoring session, just remember that you need to get to your room in the one-on-one about 10 minutes ahead of time. Like yesterday, we're going to have a lunch session, so make sure that you check that out, where authors, agents, editors are going to be hanging out. It's a great chance for you to chat with some of our guests as well as each other, and there's also some breakout rooms that you can move into. Also, our official bookstore for our conference is once again Foxtail Books. So check that out. They have recommended titles on writing, like Stephen King's On Writing, and also all of our guest books at the bookstore that is on our webpage. If you've got any questions about that, ask me. Coming up on October 22nd, Foxtail and Broadleaf are going to be partnering for Authorpalooza, and it's going to be crazy. We've got like about 12 authors right now. It's going to be awesome, a face-to-face section, not a formal event, but an event where it gives you an opportunity to meet and have conversation, get some books signed. It's going to be an awesome time, and that is at Foxtail Books on October 22nd. The Broadleaf team also wants to remind you that we are offering a pre-registration special. So it's a great time to sign up for next year. Don't forget that we are going to be face-to-face. We have already talked and arranged with the Decatur Library, so we're going back to our roots for a 2-day event there, and we are super excited with working with the Decatur Library. Also want to remind you that we are a nonprofit, and we do kind of live and die by that. So please pre-register, renew your membership, and if you want to make a donation, you can do that too on our webpage. Just make sure that you could do that when you register, or if you've got any questions about that, please ask me or another Broadleaf member. So, today we have with us 3 awesome guests. First off, we have Denny S. Bright. She is an award-winning historical fiction writer, and she's been kicking it with Wild Women and the Blues, her 2021 publication, and In the Face of the Sun, her 2022 publication of historical fiction. She is a former professional dancer and public relations professional, and she's now an adjunct professor at the MFA program at Drexel University, a book critic for NPR, and she's a freelance writer whose work has been published in USA Today, Harper's Bazaar, and Frolic Media. She is a member of the Historical Novel Society, Women's Fiction Writers Association, and Tall Poppy Writers. She's originally from Chicago, which I can see influence in her books, and she now resides in Savannah, Georgia, and can be found online at DennySBryce.com. So welcome, Denny. Our next writer, I think I kind of know him. Andy Davidson. He is a Bram Stoker Award nominated author of In the Valley of the Sun, The Boatman's Daughter, and the forthcoming The Hollow Kind, coming out this coming Tuesday, October 11th. He holds an MFA from the University of Mississippi. He's born and raised in Arkansas. He makes his home in Georgia with me, his wife, and all of our cats. So welcome, Andy, from down the hall. And finally, we have with us Marlena Frank. Marlena is the author of young adult fantasy and horror novels, including several books that have hit the bestseller list. Her work has been praised by readers' favorite and featured in Des Moines of Literature magazine. She is a Georgia native, and she is an active affiliate member of the Atlanta chapter of the Horror Writers Association. Yay! And she's an active member of the Science Fiction Fantasy Association, an avid member of the Atlanta cosplay community. Her and her sister doing awesome cosplay. You can see those on Instagram and online. She lives with her sister and two incredibly spoiled adopted cats. So welcome, everyone. I have really been looking forward to this because I'm kind of obsessed with genre. So we were talking about some topics of conversation before the panel and through email. So I just kind of want to open up with, like our title suggests, genre is sometimes a marketing device. So we're going to be talking about like the bookshelf, how is it marketed, or maybe the industry, and then maybe beyond that. So first off, how have you each come to understand genre as what you do? So I want to start with Denny. Historical fiction, genre, what do you do? How is your understanding of
that? My understanding of the genre of historical fiction is that it's an umbrella for a number of different subgenres that include everything from thrillers to mysteries to general fiction to literary fiction to romance fiction. So understanding how you want to, what story you want to tell is, of course, your first step. I stay in sort of balancing a line between general fiction and literary fiction. And, but I have a component, always have a component of mystery. To me, any book written is about some type of mystery, because you're not going to tell your reader everything that's on your main character's mind, or that's going to be a serious plot point on the first page. So that's what keeps the pages turning, because I do write commercial fiction, which is different from pure literary fiction. Now we're diving into my NPR head a little bit because I'm going a little too far. So,
no.
Yeah, historical fiction that I write is definitely going to have some of the components. It's not going to necessarily be, I don't write romance, for example, because romance has its set of rules, but I do write a love story. Love stories are always, those types of relationships are always a part of the stories I want to tell. So that's just my initial response to your question, because fortunately or unfortunately, I could go on.
No, that's great. We're going to be unpacking that. You've already brought up a lot of great follow-up there with that. Thank you, Denny. So Andy, based on what Denny has just talked about, because she's already talked about kind of mixing it up, what is your understanding of genre and what you do with your work?
Well, I sort of think of it on two levels, right? So there's genre that applies to the writing, and then there's genre that's the marketing device. Most of the time, those things tend to hold hands. They're kind of the same thing. A horror novel in your mind here is a horror novel that is marketed, as a horror novel. But I think Denny's right to the idea of it being an umbrella, because I think of horror as there are all these subgenres technically with horror that I think writers resist that classification sometimes. Sometimes people lean into it. Either way is a good way to go. I kind of walk the middle of that for me in my own work. Like I like to think of what I'm doing as horror primarily, but I also like to think of it sometimes as Western or noir or thriller, or whatever elements need to be brought in, historical, to tell the story. And so I think of genre first and foremost as a blending of different elements, like it's their ingredients to put in, right? So you've got a recipe you're making, so you can pull from the horror genre, you can pull from other genres, like, as I was saying, crime or whatever. So that's sort of how I approach it.
Marlena, on paper, you look like maybe the most, I don't want to say purist, but you've got like, you're a member of the science fiction writers, you're in the horror association, you are writing fantasy, but I suspect that's not that clear cut. But how do you see genre working in your fiction, or your understanding of genre in what you do?
So I tend to think of it as like my toolbox of what I need for the story. And so, like, for example, when I was writing my young adult horror novel, The Seeking, I didn't expect it to go in a science fiction direction, but that's kind of where the story led to help explain the dystopian world that they were living in. And that's just what the characters and the plot needed for that. Now, I don't usually write science fiction, but that book overall is a horror novel, and it has science fiction elements to it. So I think of it as, that's a little bit of that for my toolbox, a little bit of sprinkling of that in there, but that's not the targeted genre for that book. So that's what I kind of look at it as, okay, I need a little bit of science fiction for this to make this world come complete and to help me have more weirder monsters in this book. So whenever I'm writing different genres, that's kind of what I look at. And I look at my audience too. So when I write young adult fantasy, I pull back on that horror quite a bit because that's not my audience for that. I have other books over here I can dive into that more. But with my young adult fantasy series, I'm looking at a younger age range. I'm like, okay, we're not going to get too extreme with this, so I'm not needing that level of descriptions here or something along that line.
That's a fantastic point that you're making, Marlena, that when I initially think of genre, I think of like historical, mystery, horror, but you're bringing up the point that genre sometimes can be the audience for work.
I think what they're expecting, audience expectations are what you're meeting. Like Denny was saying, the romance genre, for example, has very specific beats and very specific types of endings that they expect. And if you veer out of that, you're going to really upset that audience. I find horror to be one of the more flexible genres to write in because the audience tends to be more flexible with their expectations. You want to throw in aliens or something, they're like, cool, we're on the on the bandwagon with this. But other genres aren't as forgiving about stretching those boundaries, and so you have to know who you're writing for.
Well, and there's the rules of the toolbox of the genre. There's the audience, but there's also, and we've already touched on this, marketing. Denny, how do you see marketing impacting with what you do in historical fiction?
Marketing, okay, there's in my mind, the marketing publicity range goes two ways. How do I market my brand to my followers, my social media brand, et cetera, how the marketing departments of my publishers, how they target and position my books. For example, Wild Women in the Blues, there was a lot of buzz surrounding that book because it made one of Oprah Winfrey's lists and some things like that. So what ended up happening is that the marketing publicity people put a tagline on it that helped make sure people understood it was historical fiction, make sure people understood there was some elements of a love story, since my background had associated me with romance so deeply. I was once on the board of directors for the Romance Writers of America, for example. So there was that they had to make sure people understood this was not going to be a romance, because romance, as you were saying, Marlena, is that ending is critical. HEA, that's the only way to describe happy ever after. romance, that they can either get married or they can be in a happy ever after. The other element of genre that I wanted to talk about, because you see this a lot on Goodreads, are triggers. People are telling people what in this story might be a trigger, and I think that's valid. I'll go back to romance quickly. So for example, you'll have closed door, open door, heat levels, et cetera, that are associated with the romance genre.
That's
so that marketing is important.
Yeah,
It gets complicated because that becomes part of the marketing strategy for your publicists and for your publishers. So with historical fiction, association is helpful because you're selective with your cover quotes, your blurbs. So for example, I had people like Laura Camoni and Stephanie Dre, and historical fiction people were my primary blurbs. So anyway, those are just some of the components, and the publishers use that very much to sell into, if the sales department is using that to target a year out in their efforts of getting that book in store, in that store, for example, versus Barnes and Noble versus the ebook Amazon track. So it's a lot of stuff.
It is a lot of moving parts. And when you were talking, I was thinking about some of what Andy, you are going through, with or through the course of your career with marketing and genre. I was wondering if you could talk about genre for you at the beginning with In the Valley of the Sun, how maybe that changed a little bit.
I was aware very keenly, I guess, when I wrote that I was writing a horror novel. I never thought of it as anything else. I mean, it had elements of a Western to it, and certainly, but it always in my mind, it was a vampire novel. And of course, at the time that it came out, I was very cagey about not using that word for lots of reasons. It came out in 2017, and so it was right at the tail end of vampires are everywhere in YA, and they've become sort of, I guess, defanged, for lack of a better term, in terms of like the kinds of depictions of vampires we were seeing in literature. And so I queried many agents with a query letter that did use the word vampire, and did not get any nibbles on that at all. But in the book itself, that word doesn't show up. And I think that was always in the back of my mind, subconsciously, like a choice that was going to play to the book's strength when it came time to market it, in particular, if it ever got picked up, and it did. And I believe that the publisher called it a supernatural thriller. So we weren't comfortable yet with calling things horror again at that moment in the book publishing world. And even when my second book came out, The Boatman's Daughter, in 2020, we still were not all on the same page. I know that independently, like independent presses and publishers had already kind of pushed horror back into the mind of readers, but the mainstream publishers were not caught up yet until, I guess, Paul Tremblay and Stephen Graham Jones and those guys kind of started selling books at a big in a big way. So like with the third book that's just about to come out 2 years later, they seem comfortable calling it horror. But I do remember having conversations with my editor about the second book, and she's like, well, we really want to get this to as many people as possible. So there was this baked in idea that the horror audience was not a mainstream audience, which I think now, I mean, arguably, I guess, is pretty mainstream compared to what it was just 2 years ago.
So you've seen that kind of evolution of the way genre is marketed throughout your 3-book journey so far. Yeah, that is fascinating. Marlena, when you write, do you always, you said, you think of genre as you have a toolbox that gives you the toolbox. Is that always your approach to writing, is deciding a genre first and having those tools laid out, a primary genre?
Yeah, I try to aim for a primary genre, and I used to try to write specifically in a single genre when I was first starting out, especially with short stories and things. But as I've gone along in my career, I've found that what rings truest for me in my stories is being more diverse with the genres that I use and picking them up as needed for things. If I try to box myself into a single genre category and only write within that particular category, and don't stretch the limits or anything like that, that can be difficult, and suddenly it makes the writing feel a little bit hollow for me on my own work. So I've had to start just embracing the fact that I tend to write cross genre stories and working with that more. And honestly, the marketing portion of it is more difficult, but when I find readers who like the style that I write, they tend to be very, they tend to read all my stuff. So that's a good thing. It's just a smaller niche, and it's harder to find those audience members whenever you do cross genre. Again, it goes back to whenever you're choosing particular genres to write in, you have different audiences. So whenever you try to mix those, you're going to be getting a smaller subsection of various audiences.
So people, though, when it's a Marlena Frank work, they have expectations of mixed genres. So you've got kind of does that give you any kind of freedom when you're writing to think, well, my target audience is on board for this, or are you still kind of, okay, that's yay.
Yes. And I have readers who trust my work is not going to touch on certain topics, I think, but they also know that the kind of stories that I write and the kind of characters that I create, and so they're on board. They're like, okay, I'm hopping into this car and I'm ready for a ride. So that's the goal, I think, with any writing, is to try to find those readers who are interested like that and invested.
When I think all three of our writers here are big mixed genre people. I mean, on paper, you one or two categories, but I think all three of you mix it up. I want to open the door to this topic that I think is interesting, but most people are like, oh no. But Denny, you brought it up. You mentioned literary, and you mentioned commercial. Yes. So, and I am fascinated with those kinds of distinctions. They're not genre exactly, they're not audience exactly, but there's a Venn diagram overlap. So can you talk a little bit about what you see as the distinction between commercial and literary, or do you, maybe personally and marketing?
Well, I'll go to, I was fortunate enough to participate in a Tin House workshop program on the West Coast a few years ago. And one of my instructor for that gave what I thought was one of the best definitions for the difference between literary and commercial. Well, two things he said. One was that literary as the plot turning points are on themes. So they're more theme directed, as opposed to commercial fiction, which turns on story, versus, because you don't have to have a specific plotty story with literary fiction, because the focus is on the themes. His other definition is a book that sells versus a book that doesn't sell. So he said, and he said the literary, if you don't want to make money, write literary fiction. So all of the people out there who love literary fiction, I am deliberately not mentioning his name. But what he emphasized was the importance of the marriage of the two. In his mind, you want people to buy your books with his perspective, so mix it up a little bit, so that you have a story turning on themes that also has a strong plot, that also has interesting characters and very complex characters. So there we go with that literary commercial fiction difference. I do want to comment that I'm so excited about horror and things of that nature, because was. I started, I used to write something called fan fiction, and the genre that I wrote in was Buffy the Vampire Slayer. So I have this great vampire book under the bed that I am so looking forward to, because vampires are coming.
They are.
And all of their various, from the type that scare you to death for real, the type that are romanticized, but I love those stories, like Chuck Hogan's books with, I can't pronounce his name, but The Fall, The Blank, some of the, I love those. And anything written by the gentleman who wrote Silence of the Lambs. I read all of those books before they were movies. And to me, those, and they're old, I know they're older books, but they have that wonderful mix of horror, crime, and thriller. I mean, and talk about just jumping into multi-genre storytelling. And a real good TV series now is Interview with the Vampire is back with a new casting on AMC.
Are you just talking about so much I love? I love Silence of the Lambs and Buffy and Interview with the Vampire. That's all like great stuff happening. And I think that does speak to what Andy said about how like horror is coming back, and that maybe traditional publishing is like a step or so behind the idea of what the public is hungry for. I know my students talk about that a lot, about how like horror is not an icky or weird thing anymore. They read it, they love it, they do. Andy, I want to take a thread of what Denny said about that tin house comment about, that's a fascinating definition about the distinction between literary and commercial. And just, I mean, I've got some thoughts about what you might say, I don't know, but I just want to throw that back over to you, because I feel like you're constantly balancing those things yourself in your work.
Yeah, the whole conversation that surrounds literary, the term, is a touchy conversation to have, because so many people bristle at that word, and I tend to bristle at it a little bit. I mean, I think like, I'm thinking of like, librarians like Becky Spratford, who in the horror community she'll come down on anyone that uses it. I mean, Gabino Iglesias used it in one of his tweets, and she was right there underneath him replying to him saying, whoa, 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 whoa. So I sort of think that everything like Denny was describing is good writing. So like that middle between literary and commercial is just like, you can just call it good writing. Like, it's, if you're doing things that are based in complex characters, whether you're writing purely in a genre or you're doing what the marketing world would say is literary, like those two things to me just meet in the middle for good writing. So complex characters, plots that move, that are driven by story and theme together, I think are a wonderful combination. So any action or event that happens in your story should somehow reflect what the story is about, right? So all of that to me just like becomes one thing, and that's where I aim for when I write, is just all of that. And so I definitely understand the hesitancy to talk about literary as a separate genre, because it has this like air of snobbery about it. For people who work purely in genre and aren't being published by Big Fives or Big Fours or whatever. So I think like even one of my mentors at Mississippi, he always sort of made fun of the idea. And he was like, I mean, if you wanted to call someone literary, you could call Barry Handel literary. But Barry was also someone that pronounced literature, literature. And he put that little spin on it. Like, that's a bogus notion in a lot of ways. There's just good writing and bad writing.
Well, and that is funny. And Barry was like, why aren't there more pirate stories?
Right.
Well, can I throw something out? Because
yes, please, Denny, go ahead. Yes.
Andy reminded me that we're also talking about bookshelves and marketers and what they do with that. And an example is book covers and how they put certain things. You'll see both of my book covers on behind me of my first 2 books. To the right, you have a very classic historical fiction cover with my gal with her 1920s dress, blah, blah, blah. Even though it's a dual storyline story, which you will find, dual timeline, which you'll find often in historical fiction, they always put the longest ago cover image on the cover. And quite often, if you look at Kate Quinn or Stephanie Dray or Beatrice Williams, you're going to see covers that have a couple of other images. They'll give you an airplane if it's World War II, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Literary, my other cover is considered a literary fiction cover. It's just giving you a mood, not giving you any real information on the story. Ooh, turning out lights is not a good thing here, but it'll come back.
We can see you.
Yeah, but you know, I have to set up all my lighting. Okay, so this is a literary cover. This book is 800 pages, called The Love Songs of W.E.B. Du Bois. Fabulous novel, great literary cover. This is commercial cover, Island Queen, historical fiction. You can tell right off the bat. Daisy Jones and the Six. It is giving you a cross because of that image being 1970-ish, 1980s, getting a couple of little things. So this is also another cross. It's called The Attic Child by Lola Jane, which is again giving us some flavor of literary, but also giving you a commercial feel. So that's the other transition. Indie pub. One thing that I love about what's happening in the industry, especially with indie publishers, is the heightened awareness of the importance of covers.
Right.
Because in the earlier days, you know, it was sort of like, oh, okay, anybody can do a cover. No. And you're also selling on, you know, 2 inches. So that's, it's really changed a lot of. And so, and it also, once your publisher puts that cover on, it also, they've already made a decision on how they're going to market it.
Right. And I was going to ask the great follow-up with Marlena, your covers, I love your covers. They're gorgeous. And so I wanted you to talk a little bit about how you've made decisions about covers, because you're working with an indie publisher, but you have a lot of control, don't you, on the choices of what your covers look like? Could you just talk a little bit about that process?
So when I've been working with small presses, I've had one who just gave me a cover and there was no changing with it. I've had another who they designed the cover and we went back and forth with small adjustments with them. So there is some movability there. With the stuff that I've indie published, I have gone through and researched the kinds of covers in my genre to make sure that they are going to fit what readers are expecting to see. And, you know, that one is a, you know, dark fantasy thriller series. And, you know, you've got to make sure that your covers match the genre that you're writing, and especially when you're self-pubbing, because that's all on you to figure out and to make sure that you're meeting those expectations with cover. When you're working with a small press, sometimes they have the ability to be a little bit more lenient with how they're building a cover, but sometimes it's just like, this is what you're getting and this is all we have. So it really just depends on who you're working with and which small press you are working with. I've worked with a bunch of them over the years. So
But Andy, you saw an evolution of your cover of In the Valley of the Sun that kind of tracked marketing.
Yeah, the term that my editor used when we were talking about the hardback for that book, this was an independent publisher, was upmarket. They wanted the cover to be upmarket. So they did something that was kind of evocative of a mood or an emotion, as Denny said. That was, I think, despair was the word I gave them, and so they They image of the sun rising, darkness, all this stuff. Well, when the time came for the paperback to come out years later, it took a couple of years for the paperback to drop. I got a note from the editor who was different from the previous editor that said they really wanted to go with horror. They wanted to say horror. So I went with like an idea or two. I sent them time period was the 80s, cowboy, vampire, put those three things on there. And they didn't get the brief very well. So I ended up just making like a terribly ugly Photoshop mock-up of what I was saying. I grabbed a cowboy hat from a Louis L'Amour novel. I grabbed a skull from a Brian Lumley novel, and I cut out an eye hole and I stuck the previous cover from the hardback reduced in that eye hole, so the sun was right in the middle of the eye. It looked awful. But it was exactly what I had in my head in terms of like what they could do better. And I sent it to them, and then sure enough, like the book came out and it was exactly the thing I had said too. So it was like, I kind of designed the cover.
It wasn't exactly.
Okay.
No. I mean, it looked good. It looked good, but it was exactly the composition. And so I had that experience where you had to basically tell your publisher, this is what horror is in this, like, this is what this book is a mashup of, and here it is.
But then you shifted to a new publisher.
Yeah.
That was what, Big 4-5. And how did that change the cover?
It's a very set process where so many months out, they give me 2 covers after they get some input from me about ideas for what it should be. And they show me one and they show me the other. And they're cagey about it because I know they do one that's okay. But then they do the one they really want me to pick. And I always pick that one because it's the most beautiful and amazing cover. And it's right. I mean, they're right. So I kind of don't worry about my covers right now. That's one thing that anxiety has been taken away. So I trust their process, but I know a lot of writers don't. But I will say my publisher gets what I'm doing, I think, to a degree that it gets the mix of genres correct. So.
And Andy, we had sorry, go ahead, Denny.
No, I was just wanted to add about covers because, for example, the Wild Women in the Blues cover, this is like the 4th treatment. My publisher for these 2 books is Kensington Books, and they're more so top 10 mid-size publishing house. But I ran a marketing firm for a number of years, so I'm pushy about those things. Mm-hmm. And so I was very much a collaborator in that process. In this process, because of the success of the first book, our initial treatments were in this vein, but they weren't working. And one of the things that I've learned from marketing, going back, not that I worked on this project, but sort of like Coca-Cola, when it came out with its new Coke, years ago, and the people were like, well, what was wrong with the original Coke? And we don't like this new Coke. So why try to duplicate something as opposed to going in a different direction? So they ended up sending me the 2 versions. That's why it came to mind, because we had one, but after going through about really bad versions, then all of a sudden I got 2 versions, and it was like, which one? And one was crap and one was not. So we went with that one. And one other thing is, sometimes if you're working with a Target or a Barnes and Noble, I'm hearing lately, if they're going to buy, they can influence covers.
I heard a story about that actually with, I won't say who it is, but my editor, it was Crystal, it was at BoucherCon a couple of years ago. We had dinner with my editor at my publisher now, with a couple of other writers. And this was an imprint for a Big 5. And she talked about how the Barnes and Noble book buyer refused to order her book if it kept the same title that she had. Mm-hmm. And she ultimately changed the title to something else because the title according to the book buyer, just wouldn't sell. Nobody would want to buy a book called that. And yeah, I was shocked by that. I had no idea.
That happened to this book. We had to change the title.
Wow.
And one of the things that is currently an issue right now is with young adult authors, and Barnes and Noble is no longer going to be stocking hardbacks of those books, only paperbacks. And SFWA writers are kind of concerned because they're like, okay, does this mean we're not going to be having hardbacks available? And of course, income impact and things like that. So it's because things are getting more expensive for bookstores. So yeah, things are constantly evolving in the field. So.
Well,
That's
I might
huge.
have to have an offline conversation with you about that. That's amazing.
Yeah.
Because teenage
That
buyers
is something.
is a big fan of that hardcover book.
Right.
So that's going to be coming in soon. I don't remember the date that's supposed to go live, but just heads up.
That's amazing. Well, I know we're going to keep talking, but we have had two good questions pop up in chat that I think are super relevant to what we're talking about. One of them, Zach asked, Andy, he asked about the term upmarket. He said he wasn't quite sure what that term was. Could you, and I think a lot of people maybe who aren't like inside the industry marketing probably haven't heard that. What does that mean?
I'm not even sure myself. I think it's a snobby way in publishing, I think, of saying we want to sell this to people in New York bookstores. We want to sell this to people who buy fiction from the new fictions front and center rack at Barnes and Noble. We don't want to sell it to people who just buy science fiction or fantasy and in that way, it's a snobby term. That's what it is. But I think whatever the market is, I always thought of it as like, I mean, it's definitely a hierarchical term. It's just kind of hard to get around that. So yeah, unfortunately.
I think Becky Spratford would be very angry at upmarket, like upmarket horror, because that sounds like also literary.
Well, like I do feel like apologetic for the industry to a certain degree, because I think there are, like, in everything that involves like money and selling, like you've got to, if you're going to keep your business working, you have to do what the numbers tell you to a certain extent. The problem in publishing is that the numbers become too all powerful and risks aren't taken and things aren't pushed, and we get comfortable doing the same thing over and over again. And so publishing becomes this giant, this is just my opinion from 5 years of watching the way publishers work. It becomes this giant Titanic ship that we can't turn quickly in time to avoid, whatever is coming. So
iceberg.
Sorry, that's
No,
well,
true.
I have another question from Zach, and Marlena, I want to start with you with this one, but everybody can join in. Zach asked, when you have a work that is housed in one genre, fantasy, horror, romance, but has strong themes, influences from another, nature writing, historical fiction, political commentary, how do you articulate that to an agent, an editor, and maybe we could also add maybe your audience, whatever you think is relevant?
Well, and I think you should focus on your main genre hits there. I think they said fantasy, horror, and romance were their main ones. Honestly, you could probably go with something like dark fantasy romance, or and pick horror romance is also a big thing right now too, and lean into that. And then in your description, where you're giving your query or your pitch, that's where you add in the additional things like the nature writing and things like that. That's where you give the detail showing, okay, I'm in this genre, but here's why my book's different, and here's why it's going to be, it's in this box, but here's the additional flavor that's in here with it. And I think that's how you have to look at it when you're trying to pitch it, not only to agents and editors, but to readers whenever you're talking to them. Figuring out how you're going to pitch it to your readers will help you figure out how to pitch it to your agent and editors too.
And I like the way you answer that question, because that's very helpful for people who maybe they're at the early stage of their career and they've got something they're writing or they've got a finished manuscript, and how do they talk about it? Denny, along lines of what Marlena said, what kind of advice would you give to a young writer who is doing something multi-genre? How do they articulate that to an agent and editor?
Well, they have something called high concept that they always like to get a little buzz about. So what I mean by that is, so let's say somebody says to you, we're going to do a book. My book is about, I'm trying to remember one of my high concepts. What is the name of the movie? I can't remember right now, but I'll use one. Atonement meets Valley of Dolls. Okay.
So you're talking about comp, right? You're talking about articulating a comp.
If you traditionally, they call it high concept. What is that couple of sentences or one sentence grabber that will give the editor, agent, a place to put it in their minds, because there's so much information coming at these entities. But going back to what Marlena, I definitely agree with everything that she said, but this is just another playground to get the similar point across when you're writing that query letter, or trying to pitch your book in an elevator pitch. There's another term. I in my marketing class that I teach at, because I teach a class called Marketing for Authors, another thing to look at is who are those authors or those books that are comparable to what you're trying to accomplish. I had a friend who debuted in 2021 with her book, and it was during the ongoing success of the Crawdads book. But so she definitely used that book as a identifier that helped communicate to whomever that this is what the story is about. And when the publisher or editor buys into that, I had, Wild Women in the Blues, they actually sometimes marketed it as, if you liked the Seven Husbands of, I read the book and I can't remember the rest of the husbands, but I love that book by Taylor Jenkins Reid. I was like, yeah, compare me to that book, please God. Okay, then I get into what does my banking account look like, but but anyway, so those are some of the things that you can do with those comparisons that translate into, for the marketing people, that can be used when you're pitching to try to get that agent. And your agent will craft that sort of pitch to your proposal when you go to editors. Not just your book, but they also they want something tight that they can go, yeah, let me go look at this. That sounds interesting.
Andy, could you talk a little bit about that kind of comp with your work, either the marketing or the creation of it? This meets that, or if you like this, then you'll.
I came up with one or two for my first book. I came up with one. I think I called it Taxi Driver Meets Tender Mercies by Way of Near Dark. So I came up with those three things.
That's good.
But the second book was so weird to me, even I didn't know what to compare it to. So I didn't have one for that. And I don't think the publisher did either, come to think of it. But they did, the thing that the independent publisher that my first book came out through did was they compared it to, they said if they did the if you like thing. So if you like Joe Hill, if you like, I forget who else, but the third one was Anne Rice. And I immediately was like, well, it's got a vampire in it, but it's Anne Rice. So I asked them. Now I would just say, could we take that off? But then I was like too naive to know better. So I just said, could we say classic Anne Rice? Because I had read The Wolf Gift. And I did not want to be compared to The Wolf Gift. But in terms of like, yeah, what?
Well, I was going to say, what about the comps now? You said that they didn't have, this is your new publisher, so they didn't have a comp for the second book. What about the third book? Have they done comps, or if you like this, then that?
I think it's more like they chose the people they chose to blurb it. It goes
Okay.
back to that, because I
What
think
Denny said, yeah.
yeah, it's got a bit of historical fiction in it, so they got Alma Katsu to blurb it, and she specifically blurbed it about historical fiction. And even she in her blurb is like, whatever you call this, it's these three things, but it's good. So I was grateful for that. Yeah.
Well, sometimes this the high concept piece is more so when you're an early author, because
Right.
after you have your books in the marketplace and you have success, you are your own comparison. So they
That's
don't.
the goal.
Yes.
That's the goal, yeah.
They can you so through that. Then that blurb is the key thing. So we spent a lot of time with Wild Women in the Blues as part of the pitch and blah blah blah. And I still can't remember what the high concept was, but I can't remember the name of the movie, but it was sort of like Judy Garland, and was one of her classic early films where she was an actress, and it was versus Upstairs, Downstairs, or something like that. I can't remember. It's been a long time. It's been 2 years. I should remember this. It's not like it's that far ago, but it's 4 books ago. So that's why. But anyway, that I feel that for those initial pitches, those are just some of the things you can use, because you want to crack open that door. You want
That's a good point.
You want to get that editor to buy if you're going traditional. If you're going indie, you want to study the marketplace so you know where you want to grab hold of potential new readers, especially if you're a debut author.
Well, and that's a wonderful point. It's kind of a, where are you in your career, how this would operate. We have a wonderful question from John Green, and it's kind of it's a big one that I think might pull a lot of ideas in. John writes, why do writers and teachers of writing typically want to quickly identify writing of any form as a particular genre? Is it necessary to categorize so quickly? Is it just a cognitive shortcut for readers so they know what they are embarking on by reading the work? So many books are hybrids, but even those are labeled by publishers for marketing purposes. So, whoa, as an English teacher, that's a fantastic question, as well as our panel today. What do y'all think? Let's start with the philosophical question. Marlena, why do you think that we're so quick to want to categorize a work?
I think it is like you were saying, John, I believe it was John, a cognitive shortcut for referencing. So if you think about art, like if you want to buy a piece of art, all you got to do is glance at it. If you want to watch a movie, you've got trailers, you've got a movie poster, and you can even look at the actors and the directors in it to get a feel for what kind of style of movie you're looking at. But with a book, that's a good amount of several hours that you have to use to be able to understand what this is and what it's going to include. You've got a blurb and you've got a cover, and I think genre helps with that. Because can you imagine going into a bookstore where there are no genres and there's just books everywhere where would you even go to? So I think it is a shortcut there, a cognitive shortcut to be like, okay, these are very loose categories, but they're the best we got. So if you like these kinds of books, you can go down this aisle over here. I think that's where it really goes. And I do think that it should be malleable. I really don't think genres should be set in stone as these are the only genres that are out there. I think they should be constantly changing, because otherwise that's just not as fun. And I think we should always be pushing those genres. So,
Andy, what do you think?
Well, I teach, we don't have a program here yet, but we have, sort of a growing creative writing body of students. So I teach an intermediate and advanced fiction class, and I teach it in terms of genre, but not just genre like this is what a horror novel is, but this is how fiction operates. It borrows from one thing and becomes something else. So like a unit that I have is something called the real and the unreal. So where I have students in that unit combine their work, drawing from, say, the influence of a story like, I don't know, something by Raymond Carver, which is about as real as you can get, and then pulling from maybe something by Stephen King or Shirley Jackson, which incorporates these other elements. And I try to get them to see that, like, you don't have to think in these stark terms. So one of the reasons that I teach genre is to break down the barriers that the marketing of genre has kind of established. So I don't teach it necessarily as a cognitive shortcut, because I think sometimes, like, students aren't fully educated. Like when you're a young writer, you may not even be fully aware of what genre is or can be. So I like to teach it in order to kind of tear it down and rebuild it in a way. But in terms of, hybrid books and marketing, I think that's just, like Marlena said, the bookstore has sections, and that helps people know what they want and sell to them. Yeah.
What do you think, Denny? It's marketing, but you're also a writing teacher.
I'm a marketing and writing teacher. And
yeah.
So it's more, there's left side, right side, and when I'm brains. And when I'm talking to my marketing people, I say, creativity, writing your book, being that best book possible that you can get down on the page is your goal. In my class for marketing for authors is discoverability and cluttered marketplace. So what can you do to be discovered? What can you do to differentiate yourself within the framework of existing marketing tools and information? So everyone has been conditioned as a buyer to say, well, I'm going to go look for this type of book. And until you can have the name Stephen King and say, oh, what are the Stephen King books? Or when you walk into a space,
right,
or what have you, there are just so many authors. When I came out with my first book, I did have name recognition in certain areas of the writing community and the general public, because I actually did a lot of freelance writing to get my name out there. I did things to get my name out there. So I had a starting place. But for so many authors, that's not the case. So you have to really look at how are you going to break through a cluttered marketplace, differentiate yourself, and be discovered. So that's where all of that genre information comes in handy. On the other hand, that other side of the brain, I really love the idea of not crippling a writer or paralyzing an early writer with too many definitions, because what they hear, what young people hear, or young writers, because age is irrelevant to a certain extent, what young writers hear, they believe so quickly. I know I did. And it's sort of like, oh yeah, that's how it's done. Or, oh yes, I can do it that way. You don't have to do it their way or any way. You have to find your way. So it's really different approaches to communicating with people who are in the writing community, and also where they are in that community.
Yeah, that's
journey.
Yeah,
where they are.
that's great information especially for our panelists. Our attendees to this panel. All those moving parts, especially with genre. That's a great point to end with there, Denny. We are close to our end time. We did have a good question about blurbs and how to get them. That's a long question, so I want to encourage our question, Hamlin. Please make sure to seek out our panelists in the open lunchtime or other writers and ask that, because that is a great question about blurbs, how to get them, what's that process like, because it is hard. But what I'd like to do, wrapping up here, is do you have something that you would like to promote or share with our attendees? Or if not, is there something that you are reading and watching right now that you'd like to kind of share? So we're gonna start with Marlena.
Okay, I have The Hunters of Canta, just came out last month. That's book 3 in my Wolves of Canta series. I've also got short stories coming out in 2 anthologies this month. Emporium of Superstition, which is all about dark fantasy and horror stories. And then Catstruck, which is a cat charity anthology. And all proceeds for that go to 10th Life Cat Rescue up in Chicago.
Oh, that's awesome. Thank you. And Andy, what do you have that you'd like to promote, or something that you're watching or reading right now?
Tuesday. The Holokind comes out Tuesday. On the same day, I've got a story coming out in Dark Matters, Human Monsters anthology from Sadie Hartman, and oh my gosh, I'm blanking. Ashley Sawyer. Anyway, Dark Matters. And I have information on my Twitter feed about book tour dates and where I'm going to be, and a lot of those are virtual, so please feel free to jump on one of those.
So yeah, what is your Twitter handle for people?
The Andy Davidson, at the Andy
Okay.
Davidson.
And Marlena, your social handle for people to follow yours?
You can find me at Marlena Frank Author and marlenafrank.com.
Okay. And Denny, what do you have coming up that you want to promote, and also your socials?
Okay, go to Denny S. Bryce on anything, Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, Twitter. I use the same handle everywhere because and that's also my website address. This is my book that's out now, Wild Woman. I mean, I just have 2 books. Here they go. I just go everywhere with them. I'm working on a book coming out next year, so look out for it, from William Morrow, called The Other Princess, historical fiction set in beginning in the 1850s about the adopted daughter of Queen Victoria, a West African enslaved girl who is saved, sacrificed by a British officer. That should be available sometime in the fall of 2023.
Oh, that's fantastic. Well, thank you so much. This is, yep.
These books.
Yes, and read those other good books. Well, we have some great stuff in the chat too for people to get those links. But attendees, this was an awesome panel. Thank you so much to our panelists. And we are having a lunch break coming up, and that is in the open room where you can go and talk to our writers. That would be lunchtime chat, room C, starts at 12:45 and goes to 2 o'clock. Thank you so much to everyone here today.